further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Manocher Daraj, who's a professor of political science at TCU. And no, we don't hold that against him. He is actually a newly minted associate of the Tower Center, so we're doing our best to get him into the right way over here. Dr. Daraj's interests are in international political economy, the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific, and those relations, and also Middle East politics and Islam. So quite a bit of to cover there, and is a very dear friend of mine. And I will admit here, he was my professor a few years ago as an undergraduate in Louisiana. So it's always good to have him join us. And I will now turn it over to him to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you very much, Ray. It's wonderful to be hosting this particular lecture series, and Ray has had a key role in inaugurating all of this, and I want to recognize his efforts. And our speaker today is an good old friend of mine, and we go way back, more than 2 decades. And it's not always the case that one has the pleasure of introducing his friend to a crowd. So that's the distinct case here. And I can go for a long time, talk about his illustrative credentials, achievements. But let me just say this, that many of us in the academe are happy when we publish 1 or 2 articles a year. Mehran publishes 1 or 2 books each year. And he's terrifically prolific and a leading scholar in Persian Gulf region and its implication for U.S. foreign policy, and has been very proactive, formerly the director of Center for Regional and International Studies at Georgetown branch at Doha, Qatar, and now he heads an initiative on Iranian studies for the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. And he's also, of course, a full professor of political science and international relation at Georgetown University. So without any further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Mehran Kamrava to you. And he will be speaking about Biden's foreign policy toward Persian Gulf countries in the Middle East for about 20-25 minutes. And after that, we would be happy to take your questions and put them to Dr. Kamrava.
Thank you very much, Manocher, for that warm and wonderful introduction. Let me start by saying what an honor and a pleasure it is to be here. My sincere thanks to the Tower Center for this kind invitation, and to my old friend, Manocher. I have to come clean and say that he is responsible for my scholarship. He reviewed my tenure file now, I think 27 years ago. First time I went up for tenure, 2 employees back. So my sincere thanks to Manocher. And Ray Rafidi has turned his camera off, but I want to thank him also, and also congratulate him on his choice of wardrobe. Brilliant choice of wardrobe, and my sincere thanks. And again, in all seriousness, thanks for this wonderful honor of inviting me to give a talk. I wanted to speak very briefly about continuity and change in Persian Gulf security, with particular emphasis on the role of the United States. Interestingly, what we see is the very quick emergence of what might be called a Biden Doctrine. Every American president has had a foreign policy doctrine. By and large, however, these foreign policy doctrines do not emerge early on in the administration, and scholars and journalists, observers, don't usually give them the title of doctrine. They talk about foreign policy pointers or markers, but very quickly over the last year, we see that both academics as well as journalists and other observers have been talking about a Biden doctrine, because the characteristics of Biden's foreign and security policy approaches are so pronounced that we can clearly see what a Biden doctrine looks like. By way of comparison, for example, the Obama doctrine wasn't really articulated until a few months before his administration ended, and that was in the form of an article that was written in the Atlantic magazine. And same thing with the Bush doctrine, and before that, the Clinton doctrine and Bush 41st doctrine. But the Biden doctrine has already emerged, and we already know what some of the main principles and what some of the main markers of this Biden doctrine are. First and foremost, one of the main characteristics of this Biden doctrine is a more restrained use of American military force. President Biden has made it clear that he's willing to use American force to advance American interests, but he is unwilling to engage in prolonged, protracted conflicts, as we saw particularly in relation to Afghanistan. Currently, the United States has something like 200,000 troops deployed overseas and has a $700 billion annual defense budget. So it's not as if the United States is retracting from its global security and military role. It remains quite robust, but the Biden administration has signaled that it is much more discerning and much more deliberate in its global military engagement. A second dimension of the Biden doctrine is the fact that it has pointed to China as an existential competitor to the United States. China has now emerged as America's existential competitor militarily, economically, and technologically. And we see that repeatedly in the diplomatic and foreign policy moves that the United States makes in relation to China. Third, the United States see Russia as a disruptor, and that is being particularly played out right now as we speak in relation to Ukraine. So in relation to Ukraine, in relation to Belarus, the Southern Caucasus, and even American arms sales to America's erstwhile allies, such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates. In all of these respects, Russia is seen as a main disruptor to the global order as the United States would like to see it articulated. Fourth, the United States sees cyber threats as ever evolving. One of the major security threats to the United States and to the global order, as the United States sees it, is cyber threats. And these cyber threats are emanating from Russia, with cyber attacks on the United States, Russian cyber interference in American elections, and also Chinese cyber espionage. And so, of course, this is quite important. Fifth, and this is where the Middle East comes in, the United States in general, and the Biden doctrine in particular, see Iran and North Korea as nuclear proliferators. And we know that, for example, North Korea, of course, is seen as a rogue actor in the international arena, but the United States continues to see Iran as a major threat to its regional allies in general and to Israel in particular. And the Vienna negotiations that are going on right now to revive and resuscitate the nuclear negotiations that the Trump administration pulled out of are a prime example of how the United States is trying to rein Iran in terms of the nuclear issue. I'll say a little more about this in a minute, but related to this is a final dimension of the Biden doctrine, and that is seeing terrorism as spreading far beyond Afghanistan. Terrorism is particularly likely to spread in places where there's no or weak central authority. And we see that in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings of 2011, we have a proliferation of weak and non-existent central authorities in countries such as Libya, Syria, Yemen, and of course now in Afghanistan with the withdrawal of the United States and the collapse of the central government and the reconstitution of that authority by the Taliban forces. Let me say a little bit about the nuclear issue before we move on any further. When Joe Biden was elected president, the assumption was that he would pick up where the Obama administration had left off. In other words, he would lift the sanctions on Iran, revive the nuclear issue, and would engage Iran in a constructive but measured manner, in a way that would be conditional in return for certain conditions. The United States and Iran would engage, and sanctions, at least in the financial area, in banking area, and in some limited trade areas, would be lifted. Well, that didn't happen because in the interim period from 2016 to 2020, the equation had completely changed. The Congress in the United States had become decidedly against the nuclear issue. The Iranians had done their best to shoot themselves in the foot, to darken their image even further in the United States. And American political spectrum had moved even further to the right, despite the fact that President Trump was not reelected. This move to the right was most discernible in the US Congress. So when Biden came to the White House, he discovered that he could not, even if he wanted to, pick up where Obama left off. And as a result, what we saw was literally 8-9 months of the Biden administration not engaging with Iran under any circumstances. And of course, scholars like Professor Doraj and others argue correctly that the reason that the United States didn't engage with Iran when it should have early on was because it didn't have a negotiating team in place. It really didn't know what its foreign policy agenda would be. And it took it some time to first attend to domestic issues such as the coronavirus pandemic, and then engage in other secondary issues like Iran. And I think it's key to remember that insofar as the Middle East is concerned, and especially as far as Iran is concerned, the nuclear issue is very high on the agenda for the Iranians and for the Middle Easterners, but not so for the Americans or the Europeans. The Americans and the Europeans are worried about China, they're worried about Putin, they're worried about Brexit and the fallout of Brexit, trying to make that divorce agreement work. And then Iran comes somewhere in the fifth level or fourth level in terms of concern. So Iran is not a big concern for the United States and its European allies. It might be a big concern in the Middle East for the Persian Gulf states, for Israel, for the Iranians themselves, but not for the Americans or the Europeans. So within this context of America's new approach towards the Middle East, first paying attention to Russia, then China, then of course issues such as Brexit and not to mention domestic issues, what are some of the overarching security issues in the Persian Gulf that are important? Well, I'm speaking to you today from Doha, in the capital of Qatar, which is emerging as the new heart of the Middle East, new diplomatic, economic, and political heart of the Middle East. And here sitting in Doha, or in Abu Dhabi, or in Riyadh, or any of the other regional capitals, I can tell you that there is continued dependence on the United States, militarily, economically, and in security issues. There is continued psychological dependence on the United States as an important provider of regional security. And this continued psychological dependence on the part of the Persian Gulf states is in turn reciprocated by America's own continued military presence. The United States is not retreating from the Persian Gulf, appearances notwithstanding. Oftentimes, we think that the United States is withdrawing from the Persian Gulf. We think America's attention is now directed at the South China Sea, or it is directed at Ukraine and East and Central Europe, or the Caucasus. Yes, America is paying attention to those places, but that does not mean that the level of American military presence and the nature of American military presence in the Persian Gulf has changed. In fact, regional purchases of American hardware and armaments continue to break records year after year. And every time you turn around, you're confronted with a new purchase new record purchase of armaments of regional actors from the United States. Military relations continue to be robust. Every time a weapon system is bought, is purchased, that includes a long-term commitment and a long-term security engagement on the part of the parties involved. And yes, in fact, the Persian Gulf states have diversified some of their military providers, some of their military purchases, but that has not necessarily meant that their dependence on the United States militarily, materially, and also psychologically has been reduced. And the primary reason for this is that rhetoric from Tehran notwithstanding, regardless of the nature of the rhetoric coming out of Tehran, there continues to be mistrust and fear of Iran in the region. This is largely because of sectarianism and the outgrowth of sectarian sensibilities across the Middle East, but particularly here in the Persian Gulf, with divisions between the Sunni and the Shia after 2011, late 2010, 2011. It wasn't always like this. There's a very famous picture of Ahmadinejad in Riyadh walking hand in hand with the King of Saudi Arabia. Former Iranian President Khatami, of course, made significant headways in a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So Iran-Saudi tensions, regardless of the rhetoric and the propaganda we might hear, have not been infinite. They're quite finite, and they're quite context specific, but nonetheless, they do exist. They're very real, and there's a very real fear of Iran. And this continues to be at the heart of the security tensions here in the region. Iranians don't understand why the Arabs fear them. They simply don't. They say, look, we have peaceful intentions. In 200 years, we have never invaded anybody. And they don't understand that these are small states, and by nature, by definition, small states like the UAE, like Qatar, like Bahrain, fear big neighbors in the same way that Ukraine fears its big neighbor, Russia or Georgia or Azerbaijan or any of these other states have to modulate and moderate their relationship with Moscow. These countries also have the same fear in relation to Iran, and that is where their dependence on the United States comes. Come and rescue us from the big bad Shia Persians. And so that is at the core of the tensions that exist. Another dimension of the security issue in the region is that despite assumptions, Russian and Chinese governments have not made headways into the region, at least militarily and definitely not yet. Maybe they want to wait for the United States to settle the region down first. President Obama came out very famously and said, I do not like free riders. And he was really referring to Saudi Arabia in terms of riding on the back of the American security protection. But that is precisely what the Chinese and the Russians are doing in the region, letting the Americans provide security in the Persian Gulf so they can continue to buy oil. China happens to be the biggest purchaser of Persian Gulf oil, followed very closely by South Korea. And so they're not militarily present here. They're not economically present. The South Koreans are, but the Chinese and the Russians are not. But there is this big fear in Washington that Russia and China might make a move into this strategic region of the Persian Gulf. Another dimension of regional security is the decline of the Gulf Cooperation Council as a multilateral cooperation forum. We saw that beginning in 1917 with the blessing of the Trump White House. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt imposed a blockade on Qatar, or a boycott of Qatar, however you want to look at it. But from 2017 until 2020, the Gulf Cooperation Council was on life support. For all intents and purposes, it was dead, and it didn't function as a regional security forum. It didn't function as a regional forum for economic integration or for political integration, and it was literally on life support. Now it has been resuscitated, or it is slowly, very slowly and haltingly being resuscitated. Nonetheless, the element of trust has been broken. These guys do not trust each other. The Qataris and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Bahrainis. These guys simply don't trust each other. And so what we see is the importance not of multilateralism, not of the emergence of the Persian Gulf region or the Arabian Peninsula as an actor that is important, but instead the emergence of and the importance of bilateral relations. The fact that bilateral relations are becoming more important. Bilateral relations between each of these states and the United States is far more robust than the relations of these countries altogether and the United States or Russia, for example. So let me end, if I may, very quickly with a couple of concluding remarks on the nature of these quite important bilateral relations. And I want to end by pointing to some questions that we should be asking in the coming future. I will fess up and admit that I don't have all the answers, but I think we can jointly, together, think through some questions that are likely to emerge. And one point that I want to, one potential point of importance that I want to point to is a country that I haven't mentioned yet and probably hasn't really been on your radar, and that is Oman. Oman, as you might know, went through a leadership transition about 2 years ago with the long reigning Sultan Qaboos dying, and now there's a new leadership, Sultan Haytham. Sultan Qaboos was a global statesman. He followed a very independent foreign policy that was able to stand up to the Saudi behemoth. He was able to stand to the Emirati financial power, and Oman was able to carve out for itself a unique independent identity here in the region. And now with a new sultan who is untested, but also with mounting economic pressures. I think one question to ask is whether Oman will turn into another Bahrain or another Kuwait. In other words, will Oman become very closely allied with Saudi Arabia in the same way that the small state and relatively poor state of Bahrain is? Or will Oman be able to manage somehow and muddle through in the same way that Kuwait has managed and muddled through, not necessarily making a name for itself? Kuwait made a name for itself in the 1980s diplomatically and otherwise, but after the Iraqi invasion in 1990, it quieted down. And so I think one point for us to watch is Oman. The other factor for us to watch in the Persian Gulf is Qatar. Qatar's emir, as we speak today, in fact, is in Washington. And nobody knows why he wants to meet with President Biden, but Qatar has historically had a penchant to punch above its weight. What we have here is a small state that doesn't realize it's small in stature, it's young in history, and it's limited in human resources. It has nearly unlimited financial resources. But what's important about Qatar is that it tries to be a global player, and consistently it bumps up against the realities of global and regional power politics. And I think one point to watch for us is Qatar 5 years from now. Will Qatar continue to have its limelight in history when price of oil was above $140 a barrel and Qatar had unlimited resources and was trying to shape the destiny of countries in 2010, 2011, 2012? Countries like Libya, countries like Syria, and less so in Yemen. Or again, will Qatar be cut to size and will continue to kind of play ball within the context of the GCC? Two final pointers I want to point to, or maybe three very quickly. First, United Arab Emirates. United Arab Emirates today is doing what Qatar was doing in 2008, 2009, 2010, which was back then Qatar was trying to shape the destiny of countries, and today the UAE is doing so. And again, what we have to wait and see is whether the United Arab Emirates 5 years from now will be cut to size. These countries, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they might have unlimited financial resources. What they do not have is unlimited human resources. And therefore, they have to rely on outside experts, on the so-called creative classes, to come and help them carry out their developmental and policy agendas. And you can rent friends, but you cannot indefinitely buy friends. And so my sense is that the limitations of human resource that the United Arab Emirates faces will result ultimately in a lowering of its aspirations as we move forward. Today, the UAE is riding high. It is shaping destinies. It is trying to influence developments in the Horn of Africa. Elsewhere, it is buying Dubai World Port, for example, is building 8 ports along the Suez Canal. But is this sustainable? And I think that's a big question mark. Then Saudi Arabia. And here's a simple question that I have about Saudi Arabia. Is Mohammed bin Salman, the young, exciting, supposedly progressive, ambitious heir apparent, the prince of Saudi Arabia, is he another Saddam Hussein? All of us tend to have short historical memories. But if we go back to the late 1970s, we had this exciting, young, progressive figure in the Middle East. He was the hope and the aspirations of the peoples of the Middle East. He was making changes in his country. He was shaping new paths and breaking new paths. He was progressive. He was exciting. He was the darling of the West. And his name was Saddam Hussein. And the question to ask is, are we seeing today the emergence of another Saddam Hussein? Somebody who now has unlimited financial resources beating up on the poorest country in the Middle East, namely Yemen. Somebody who tries to eliminate enemies regardless of the means, somebody who does whatever it takes to achieve ends. And I think that is important to watch. Now, you know that this region is known for its life tenure in terms of leadership. And so we're likely to see Mohammed bin Salman for decades to come. And I think one question for us to ask is, how is this young man going to behave when he becomes king? And what are we going to see given what we have seen in the past? Finally, Iran. Iran is in for major changes. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is 82. He's going to die any day. And he looks quite frail, although, of course, he's proven all of us wrong. Nevertheless, when Ayatollah Khamenei departs from the scene, Iran is going to substantially change, if not in ideology, if not in substance, certainly in style. And that is important. What Khamenei has tried to do was to appoint what the young generation and to man the civil service and the commanding heights of the economy and the political system with young devotees. And I think what we need to ask is 5 years from now, when Khamenei will most likely not be on the scene anymore, what will Iran look like? Will Iran go the way of China? Will Iran's Islamic Republic be as Islamic as China today is communist? China today, of course, is communist in ideology and in name, but not in economic foundations. And so will Iran be as Islamic as China is economically communist? I think that's an important question to ask. Or what will happen to the Islamic Republic? And of course, we have fundamental questions that will guide us over the next several years. And fortunately, we have the likes of Manucher Doraj, who will enlighten us as we look into the future. Thank you very much for indulging me. And I'll be happy to puzzle through some questions as we, in the remaining few minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamraba, for that very penetrating, insightful presentation. You gave us a lot of food for thoughts. And I want to take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question myself. And there are some questions in chat and in Q&A that I would pose to you later. And as our audience are listening, please post your questions as they come up so I can then pose it to Professor Kamraba. When President Biden was running for presidency, his rhetoric, as well as what he proposed to be his policy toward the region, was fairly different from what it is now. And you gave us a very succinct and comprehensive picture of Biden's doctrine as it's emerging and its major cornerstones. So he was talking about, you know, he won't be uncritically supporting MBS, and he's going to treat them as the pariah that they are, etc. And the question of giving weapons to UAE was tabled. And as you mentioned, you know, weapons sales are going as usual. And he also promised that he's going to end the war in Yemen. And Saudi military support continues under the Biden administration, and the war in Yemen, unfortunately, rages. Whereas Biden administration has been quick to, for example, condemn Houthis' attack on UAE, which killed 3 people. It's very quiet when Saudis bomb, for example, Sana'a or other areas which is under Houthi control. So what do you think has happened? Seem to be so much more continuity and timidity to chart a new course which is substantially different, or what he promised was one thing and what we see as policy so far is another. You aptly said that usually doctrines emerge at the end of administration. Are we likely to see a different Biden administration in the next 30 years, or we're seeing the cornerstones of his foreign policy advisor in the White House has said that we're going to go back to the basic. We're going to support our allies, and that's it. Your thoughts, please.
Thank you. There's Manu Chair, as always, you ask a very perceptive question that doesn't lend itself to a quick answer. But let me just say that historically, American foreign policy has been articulated through slogans of idealism and the norms of idealism. So historically, when American politicians have talked about American foreign policy, they've done so in the language of American ideals. But the reality has been quite different. In practice, American foreign policy has always been realist. It has been based on balance of power considerations, on American interests. And yes, this is not to say that American ideals have played no role, but they haven't been as dominant as we have assumed them to be, at least in terms of campaign slogans and what we see. So I think one of the things we see is that for President Biden, the ideals of candidate Biden are not workable. And so when he came into the White House, he discovered that there's this machinery of American foreign policy. There is this American weapons sales that's millions of dollars, billions of dollars, in fact, and thousands of American jobs. And so, and so there are specific balance of power considerations that he took into account. Now, one of the interesting things we see is that American presidents, I'll be very quick about this, have followed a very different foreign policy in years 7 and 8 of their presidencies than in the first 6 years of their presidencies. And these are presidents who've been two-term presidents. And this is precisely because of the nature of the American political system. The fact that every 2 years you have congressional elections. And so American presidents have been very concerned not to harm their party in congressional elections. And then in their year, if they get reelected in years 7 and 8, they become concerned about their legacy. So interestingly, if you look at the Clinton administration, he did nothing about the Palestinians and the Israeli-Palestinian issue until his final years and his final months in office, partly because he wanted to be known as something other than the Lewinsky scandal, and he wanted Palestine and Israel, Palestinian-Israeli peace to be part of his legacy. President George W. Bush followed a very different foreign policy in years 6 and 7, or 7 and 8, and so did President Obama. That's when he started negotiating with the Iranians. And so if Biden were to run, and if he were to get reelected, these are huge ifs, we might see a different foreign policy at the tail end of his second term. Otherwise, he might go the way of Bush 41, which is Bush 41 tried to follow his foreign policy principles, and he became a one-termer. Or Carter. Now, you can argue that history didn't deal either of these guys a good hand. Carter had to deal with, excuse me, a drought and the Iran hostage crisis. Bush had, by the time he was running for re-election, the American electorate was ready for a change from Republicans to Democrats. So that's an argument to be made. But so in terms of Biden's foreign policy, I think reality has hit. Madam Chair, I should just say that I have just started recovering. I'm just recovered from coronavirus, but I still have a nagging cough. So I sincerely apologize to the audience if I cough.
Don't worry, you're doing quite well. If you are recovering COVID and speaking with such enthusiasm and with such a forceful voice, I like to see you in your normal state. You're doing quite well. So let me go to there are quite a few questions accumulating in Q&A, also in chat. Let me go and post some of them to you in the remaining time that we have, so you can speak to them. The first one is basically posed by Alex Paracini, says that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is viewed as a supporting interventionist policy beliefs. Yes, as you mentioned, the administration has decreased its use of military force, such as in Afghanistan. What do you foresee the next 3 years looking like in terms of the US paradigm for its involvement throughout the world overall? Will it be removing exclusivity, or will it be removing exclusively military involvement while retaining diplomatic and cyber intelligence intervention, or some other hybrid?
That's a really good question, and we really don't know the answer, at least until we see how the current Ukraine situation pans out. Ukraine is quite interesting because, as you mentioned, as Alex mentioned, what we're seeing is the United States is quite concerned about a Russian invasion, and apparently they know something that others are not, or at least the Germans aren't as aware of. But if you look at it from the Russian perspective, they're saying, what's all the excitement? What are the Americans getting animated about? We're not going to invade. And so what we see is this interventionism, this liberal interventionism that Alex talked about, that don't you even dare threaten to the Russians. Don't you even dare threaten the Ukrainians or by moving your troops in the middle. So that's a really good question. And I don't know what we're going to see. This could very well turn out to be President Biden's biggest test of leadership in terms of staring down Putin. And, apparently, I think the way the Russian system is, I sincerely would doubt if Putin would back out right now. He's backed himself into a corner, and the Americans seem quite determined to stare him down. So I think we'll just have to wait and see how this current development turns out to really know how America will approach other issues. For example, in terms of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, if hypothetically, for example, if Iran were to make a move in Iraq, which I sincerely doubt, but we see that the United States is quite willing. Again, they've sent another shipment of weapons to Ukraine. They're quite willing to flex their military muscle to show their determination.
Wonderful. The second question is from Dr. Ali Alavi, who says, thank you for your very interesting presentation. How about Iraq? Would Iraq as a state survive as it is, or would we witness the emergence of an independent Kurdistan in the north and the Arab Iraq in the south?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Dr. Alavi. I think if Iraq were to break into three, it already would have broken into three. we're not likely to see a re-emergence of Iraq in the same way that Baghdad used to exert control over the rest of the country in the 1980s, for example, or even in the 1990s before the United States saw to it that Saddam's wings were clipped. But I think we're likely to see greater exercise of autonomy on the part of the Kurds, as they have been, and but the Shia have been in the south have been quite supportive of the central government under their own auspices. So I sincerely doubt that in the foreseeable future we'll see a disintegration or a further disintegration of Iraq. Doesn't necessarily mean the central government in Baghdad can fully and meaningfully exert its authority over all of the territory. Already we see that in the remote northwest, ISIS is re-emerging, but I sincerely doubt we'll see a re-emergence of or a breakup of Iraq as a nation state.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Dr. Farhad Bagheri, who has a PhD from Shahid Beheshti University in Iran and is currently an LLM candidate at SMU. And his question is that there has been a lot of defections and a split within the negotiating teams of the Biden administration who are negotiating with their Iranian counterparts on the nuclear deal, JCPOA. What do you think these signifies in terms of determining the outcome of this negotiation?
Dr. Bagheri, that depends on if you see the glass as half full or half empty. If you see it as half full, then you say that the departure of people like Richard Murphy, who was one of the biggest proponents of sanctions, is a positive sign that negotiations are moving in a positive direction. We have out of Iran a statement saying, and out of the Russian ambassador, statements that say that negotiations are moving towards a positive conclusion. The Americans are saying not so fast. So if you're optimistic, then you see these defections as the fact that the Americans are streamlining and are now, at least the American team is on the same page. All members of the American team, or most members of the American team, are on the same page. If you're pessimistic, then you say that negotiations, that this is yet another indication that negotiations are moving in, that they're not going anywhere, that they're at a standstill. I tend to be optimistic, and I tend to think that, for example, the departure of someone like Richard Murphy, who was dead set against lifting of sanctions, is a positive sign.
The next question is from Raymond Termini, and he asks, is the Biden administration supportive of the Abraham Accords? It has suspended the Abraham Fund indefinitely and does not seem to have made any progress in advancing normalization agreement between Israel and Arab countries.
Thank you for that question. I think any American administration would be supportive of the Abraham Accords. In principle, for the United States, this is a very positive development in the sense that, let me just say that as far as Israel is concerned, and also the United States, what's important is international recognition. For the Palestinians, yes, recognition is important. But for Palestinians, what's even more important is how they get treated at the local checkpoint. How many hours a day they have electricity and running water. What are the conditions on the ground in terms of houses and home demolitions and freedom of movement. For the Israelis, on the other hand, international recognition, particularly by the Arabs, is important. And Biden administration is fully aware of this. The critical difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration is that the Biden administration is supportive of this diplomatically and politically at a broader level, at a regional level, whereas the Trump administration wanted to use this as not just as a means of striking peace between Arabs and the Israelis, but to further contain Iran. And I think that's the critical difference. So the Abraham Accords are important to the United States. The question is, to what purpose? Further peace between more Arabs and Israel, or peace between Arabs and Israel in order to further marginalize and put pressure on Iran. And that, I think, is the critical difference between the Biden and the Trump administrations when it comes to the Abraham Accords.
Thank you for that excellent reply. The next question is from Tariq Lucien Rajev. And his question is, can you really go back to the origin of this situation, like the 1945 Quincy Agreement and what Iran was at that time? Then Iran went democratic, the US and BP overthrew Mossadegh, all this at the root of the current situation.
Tariq, you think I know about 1945? I'm not that old, my friend. It just so happens I don't know about the Quincy Agreement in 1945. But I should say this. It used to be that the United States could effect regime change whenever and almost whenever and wherever it wanted to. And as we have seen in relation to places like Venezuela, which hardly has a functioning political system under Maduro. And the United States has recognized the opposition, but has been unable to unseat a dysfunctional political system. Those days are over when the United States could, or American-based or supporters or American corporations or Europeans, British Petroleum or others, could unseat governments and effect fundamental change. So we're looking at a very different international arena. And in some ways, you can say that nation states have reached a level of strength and maturity where the global superpower cannot necessarily dictate their destinies anymore. And so if I understand your question right, I don't think we will see a repeat of the Mossadegh era in Iran.
Thank you very much. The next question, we don't have names here. Let me see, maybe we do. One moment. Yes, it is. Marty Harrison, do you believe institutional instability in Northern and Eastern Africa poses a geopolitical risk to Persian Gulf? And it continues, is there opportunity to gain influence in Horn of Africa via foreign direct investment similar to China's Belt and Road infrastructure initiative?
That's a well-crafted question because it talks about risk, but also opportunities. And I think the risk is to the domestic population in terms of absence of a central government, therefore breakdown of infrastructure. But what has happened is because countries like Eritrea and other actors in the Horn of Africa are so desperate for foreign protection, foreign investment, and foreign engagement, that has presented a wonderful opportunity for countries like the United Arab Emirates. And the fact that the UAE is now in search of military bases in the Horn of Africa. So it's not so much of a risk as it is an opportunity. Now, I should say that there are also, in terms of the risks, there are refugees, believe it or not, from places like Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea that have been going to Yemen. And then, excuse me, they've been finding their way up the coast to Saudi Arabia. And so if there's a risk, it's in those terms. But much greater attention is being paid to the Horn of Africa by countries like the UAE and Turkey that see them as areas of military bases that they can use to further project their power and influence into the African mainland. And I think that's where we're seeing a much greater activism, more opportunity for these actors than perceived risks.
Thank you very much. The next question is from E.J. Roram, and he asks, post-Khomeini, will domestic change in Iran come from the people or the government? And should we expect it to come at all?
I wish I knew. This is a question that has been preoccupying many of us who study Iran for a long time. But if history is any guide, we saw that in 2009, we had the emergence of a social movement in the form of the Green Movement. And the costs became prohibitively high. The government cracked down, and it did so brutally. And unlike in Syria, where the government simply shoots and kills you, what the Iranian government did in 2009 was that it took people, arrested them, put them in prison, tortured them, and then threw them out of prison, threw out a bunch of zombies. And the people who were released from prison told others what the costs of political activism was, the horrors that they had experienced. And that put an end, this sheer repression and fear of more repression put an end to the social movement. So your question was, will change come from the people? Well, people don't necessarily break from their daily routine. They don't risk their employment, never mind their lives, to pour into the streets, clench their fists, and shout slogans. It takes an enormous leap of faith for a social movement to emerge and achieve widespread popularity. For mass mobilization to develop, you need an enormous amount of leap of faith among a very large collectivity of people. And the conditions are difficult. And if 2009 is any guide, if people still remember it when they want to mobilize, then they won't. And so any change that might come at that point will be from within the system. This is not to say that there might be some regional contagion. Whoever guessed that the Egyptians would rise up and overthrow Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak? Whoever thought the Tunisians would overthrow Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali, or the Libyans would get rid of Gaddafi? So I don't want to say that mass mobilization or the emergence of people power, a social movement, is impossible, but it is very difficult to emerge.
Thank you. We have one comment and one last question to pose to you. It's okay. We'll just go slightly over the time allotted. The comment is, terrorism originated from the Saudi Wahhabi ideology, not Iran Shiites. Let's get it straight. If you want to react to that, please do.
I think
that's from Tariq again. Tariq right there.
I think that's spot on. But yes, absolutely. And what we see is the emergence of weak states in places like Syria and Yemen and Libya, excuse me, in which terrorism now has further room to grow.
Okay, the last question. So from Tariq, and FDR and King Abdul Aziz on the USS Quincy. That was what he was referring.
Yes, that's the Quincy Agreement. Thank you very much, Tariq.
Yes,
when I read that, I remembered, yes, of course. Yes. For someone who's written a book called The Modern Middle East, history of the region from the First World War. I should have known, I should have remembered that. But thank you very much, Tariq. I appreciate that.
And many of our audience, thank you very much for your insights and for your very timely analysis. And on that thank you note, I want to thank everyone for their engagement. I want to thank particularly Dr. Kamrava for his, as always, insightful and first-rate analysis. And what sets him aside, as he briefly mentioned, he's in the region. Not only he follows these things firsthand, but he experienced it existentially. So his insights are invaluable for that reason as well. So, and also want to thank my friend Ray Rafidi and Ora Lacey for playing a key role in organizing this event. And on that note, we'll call it the day. And there would be another lecture next month, and you will get a digital advertisement for that as well. Thank you again, Dr. Kamrava, for excellent, insightful lecture.
Thank you so very much. My thanks to the Tower Center and to you, Professor Doraj, for this honor. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'd like to wrap up as well, too, and echo what Dr. Doraj has said. We can't thank you enough for being here. I know it's a little bit later over there, but as we all know, when we start talking about the Middle East, we just scratched the surface. And I know I echo what Dr. Doraj said about we saw a lot of things coming in. There's always just so much to cover, and your analysis was fantastic, and I'm glad we connected as well, too. I look forward to following up with you on some things that we discussed earlier, and hope to see you here in the States at some point. Dr. Doraj, as usual, it's wonderful to see you again, and I look forward to getting together here soon. And I'd be remiss as well, too, if I didn't mention the hard work of Moralachi, who does a lot of stuff behind the scenes to make all this come off without a hitch. So, and also my support here that I have in the Tower Center, Jenny Aperti, and other folks here who are really behind what we're doing here on the Middle East. So thank you, everybody, and all of our usual guests and our forum members and everyone. We'll be doing more Middle East content as the semester goes forward. As Dr. Doraj said, look for what we'll be posting for next month, and for everything else we have, Middle East and otherwise. We look forward to seeing everybody. Take care and have a good day.